Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of the webinars in this series. So I am Mihir Kulkarni. I work with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, and I have been associated with curating this exhibition along with BSF, Bangalore Sustainability Forum, and the IIHS Library. So this year's, I'll quickly introduce the theme of this year's exhibition, which is still live at IHS Bangalore City Campus here in Sadashiv Nagar. So the theme we chose this year was urban ecology. So what usually we associate the word ecology or studies in ecology with very pristine or natural environments and forests and so on, but very few people actually study ecological principles in a urban settings. And there are very interesting questions which can be asked, which are rooted in both classical ecology as well as the upcoming field and changes in the field which we are seeing as urbanization is increasing around the world. So the idea was to curate an exhibition around this theme, and which we have done at our campus here. And what we have sort of included is multiple different avenues in which people have explored urban ecology. So these includes a lot of popular sort of books, technical books, scientific papers, as well as popular or more artistically oriented things like puzzles and sort of cards, which sort of introduce you to this whole concept that there is a huge diversity of organisms even within our cities, and they actually play very significant roles which we often fail to sort of acknowledge in our day-to-day lives. So this webinar series is a part of this exhibition, and we hope to make it a webinar so as to reach more people across the country in different parts of the country. So the first sort of webinar is happening today, and this is a four sort of part series which we will circulate the details soon. So in today's session, I am really glad to welcome Dr. Nishant Kumar as our speaker today. He is a faculty at the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University in Delhi, and he is also DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance Fellow at the Oxford University's Department of Biology. So he actually is studying a very unique sort of ecosystem in our capital city, and he actually studies how different animals, which can include residents as well as migratory species and wildlife in Delhi, how they are actually interacting with certain urban products like waste, which are present in the city, and how these interactions can also involve humans in it, how humans modify and shape interactions of these organisms within the city. So without wasting any further time, I invite Dr. Nishant to give his talk. And the format of this talk is sort of 40-45 minutes of uh, the actual talk, as followed by a question answer session. In case you have any other questions, you can write them in the Q&A box, which will be active now. So, Dr. Nishant, over to you. Uh, I think
Sorry,
you're on
Nishant,
mute.
you're on mute.
Okay, okay. Thanks a lot, Mihir. Hello to everyone, and thanks to BSF, Benita, Mansi, and others. It is such a fantastic occasion to be connected through internet, but at times, even within the capital city, we are connecting virtually with our students and colleagues because we have devastated our ecosystem to this stage where we literally have to transform ourselves to the initial era of being mammals. So for people who are not very well aware with what happened with the origin of mammals and the rise of mammals, in in the most plausible set of theories which we have for dinosaur extinction, it was because of a meteorite which induced a nuclear winter type of scenario. And under that, mammals who could be there in burrows and who could safeguard themselves from different atrocities or environmental stochasticities, where they took shape, while reptiles who could not maintain their body temperature in general plummeted in numbers, mammals took shape. When in Delhi, even while I speak, when we are kind of localized in our holes or homes or burrows in some ways or the other, it offers a lot of challenge, but it also kind of opens avenues of opportunity in terms of how can we challenge the the new norms under which we need to continue to progress, but we have a lot of limitations as to how much our existing environment can support the kind of development we have chosen as the trajectory for what our society would be like. So on that note, I'm going to share my presentation. And in case we have people who are not very well versed with biology, I've kept this slideshow to the minimum of biology and to have key messages for you. So on your screen, you can see the fantastic display of, yeah, sorry. So on your screen, you can see the fantastic display of how different time periods have kind of passed over the last 10, 15,000 years when we have documented history of how humans and non-humans have shared life. So on the top right corner of the screen, you can see how there are murals. The idea is that we have had various ways in which we have shared our lives with non-humans, plants, animals, microbes alike. And progressively, we are getting new evidence towards why these associations and the periodicity of these associations is very vital. On the top right corner of the screen, you can see how there are cave murals, not only from India, but also from outside, possibly the first depiction of how humans wanted to capture the kind of lives they had. On the top left, you have on screen the problem which the city of New York is facing, for which they have instituted a committee to kill rats in the city, which are the product of ways in which we make food available for non-humans. And in the bottom panels, you have like various periodicity of how humans have been interacting with non-humans in phases which we call as conflict. So on the bottom left hand, that is my head, and there is a tattoo still there, given by black kites, which are quite belligerent when you tend to inspect their nests. I think monkeys and dogs are quite familiar for everybody in terms of how they can make our lives difficult. On the bottom right corner, you have the artistic depiction of what used to be called as wolves, who were quite problematic species, or at least envisioned as a problematic species. Quite recently in Bahraich in UP and in multiple parts of UP, I think this story resurfaced in terms of how they were perceived as child snatchers. And this is one single reason why we have lost wolf populations from throughout India, talking from Rajasthan onwards, up until Bihar, people smoked the dens of wolves, anticipating that doing this would reduce the kind of conflict they were having with these demons in the human society. So I guess the screen is pretty much visible, correct? The correct screen. Mihir,
Yes.
can you?
Yes.
It's there.
Okay, cool.
It's there.
So now on the screen, I'm unsure how much of you have fathomed the idea of distribution of biomass on Earth, but this fantastic paper by Bar-On and colleagues depicts why distribution of biomass is primarily in the form of plants. And all the famous documentaries which we get to see on Nat Geo, and likewise, they're constituted in this small, tiny triangle. GTC is the gigaton carbon unit in terms of how much carbon is sequestered in a particular life form. And this small triangle for animals has further been expanded into different taxa. And it is not much of a surprise that arthropods constitute maximum biomass within the animal system. Further interesting is the fact that most of the documentaries shown on television these days, they cater to wild birds and wild mammals, such tiny triangles, 0.002 GTC and in that order. Why I'm very interested in the bottom two polygons is the idea that we have created these two interesting polygons very recently, in less than 70 years, one could say. And of course, if you recall the law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created, cannot be destroyed, and we cannot capture carbon from systems outside Earth. So the idea of sequestering carbon in the form of livestock and humans, where in India we have one livestock for every 10 human beings. So that is only possible when you capture the carbon form in some other life form. So this is the crux of how probably we have changed the face of Earth in terms of biomass distribution. What this fantastic paper has definitely missed is the fact that we produce humongous amount of waste, which half of which roughly is biomass. So on all the three major landfills in Delhi, I'm unsure how many are there in Bangalore. They all receive 500 truckloads of waste, and roughly 50% of that waste, of 500 truckload waste, is biomass, which can be consumed by different life forms, including human beings, unfortunately. And that brings us to why I have named my particular presentation so strangely the room of requirement. So I was toying with this idea in terms of whether people will gather it, but then I don't know, like there are not enough Harry Potter fans in the modern set of students. So I'll just give a brief 1 minute intro. So in the school of Hogwarts, I'm very sure everybody's familiar with Harry Potter and the wizard school. So in the school of Hogwarts, in the fourth year, Harry and his friends, they found a room. The room was called the Room of Requirement because it used to appear out of nowhere for people who were distressed and who wanted a place of seclusion against various forms of atrocity if they were depressed, if they did not have friends, and if they had situations which were not very conducive for day-to-day life. I'll just play this video for a short while. This is the character Neville Longbottom, and you can see there is a room which is appearing from nowhere in the wall itself. So throughout this presentation, I will try and argue.
You've done it, Neville. You found the room of requirement.
Oh,
It's also known as the come and go room. The room of requirement only appears when a person has real need of this, and is always equipped for the seeker's needs.
So, say you really needed the toilet.
Charming, Neville. But yes, that is the general idea.
It's brilliant. It's like Hogwarts wants us to fight back.
so if I have enthused people enough about the topic of Harry Potter and Hogwarts, maybe you can go and see the series or read the books. But the idea is, are cities the room of requirements for human beings? It appears so because they have been championed as tools of civilization right through Harappan times, if we talk about South Asia, and we have had like similar urban impacts across the world. And the question, which is the topic for our discussion today, is, are cities the room of requirements for opportunistic animals? Because we are clearly convinced that the way humans have been urbanizing or have been creating these cities, we have devastated the life forms by 70%. And with life forms, I'm saying mammals like you and me who are listening and discussing. So 70% of mammalian biomass have been plummeted in less than 70 years. And the more is ongoing while we discuss these. So this is the introduction slide. And on this slide, you will find this pyramid kind of structure with broken pieces of bricks. And I have categorically placed it like that because humans have this unique ability of altering the pyramid of energy by breaking or by plummeting the number of species or populations, and by having the possibility to introduce energy in the form of ritual feeding, which is a deliberate way, and at times unintentionally when we are putting a lot of garbage material, which is available for different life forms to consume. So under this scenario, we see a plethora of life forms around us who take or who appear to be doing fine. So whether it is a murder of crows, a flock of kites, a troop of monkeys, a pack of dogs with which you interact on a daily basis. I'm unsure how much of troublesome entity are these denizens within our cities are. But then for the vast majority of South Asian cities and likewise systems in tropics, these are part and parcel of your day-to-day life. I think as a region in the world, we have not still decided to evict them from our concept of what is a city supposed to be. So you can see a lot of people trying to like provide different ways and means in which these animals can better subsist. So in order to evaluate the condition of these non-humans objectively, I felt that it is required to define the term urban. I think if you go by United Nations and its organizations way, then 10,000 people per square kilometer is the yardstick. But the way the population is very variably and differently distributed across the planet, and infrastructure similarly is quite variable, I think we do require a definition which is holistic. So in last year with my master students, I tried to devise it, and I would be happy if you provide a critique for that. So urban, from my perspective, is having an uncanny and unnatural high per capita availability, or not per capita, per unit area availability of humans. So in an ecosystem, if you have a lot of humans, you would definitely need infrastructure to fit them in. You can't fit 10,000 people in 1 square kilometer the way they usually live in a rural system. And in order to build infrastructure, you need to draw a lot of resources from relatively rural areas. So once you draw relatively, the maroon arrow depicts that idea of uh, items being taken from rural area and procured into urban area. What is very special about this tension in between rural and urban is 65% of humans are there in roughly 3% of urban areas on the terrestrial system. But then these roughly 3-4% area people impact 70% of the terrestrial space on Earth. So how does that entail? It is a very unique system where can you imagine a system where a sink, a resource sink, which are urban areas, are deciding what happens with resource sources. So that is very peculiar about how human beings have tried to like find a niche for themselves within the existing facets of ecosystem. And because we have had situations after situations, and I think in United States, they spent $200 million to create ecosystem two, and they failed miserably, while Elon Musk thinks that he will be able to create a self-sustaining ecosystem on Mars somewhere in distant future. This is what the result of this unique tension in between sink regulating rural sources results into. So despite 400 years of marvelous scientific advancements, we are so limited in ways in which urban signatures on ecosystems are dealt. So more often than not, except for incineration and other physical forces of nature, which we can harness through science and technology, most of our waste is handled by nature, or components of nature to be precise. On your screen, you have the motivation of why I started doing research in an urban system while I'm trained as a wildlife biologist from Wildlife Institute of India. So quite an oxymoron, like trained as a wildlifer, but then doing his research in urban area. It is because of this massive flock of 10,000 black kites, which you find on the largest landfill in Asia on the eastern border of Delhi. So this spiked my interest as an undergrad in second year. And I was devastated by the fact that, okay, we have lost vultures, which was taught to us. And the student in me started to link the idea of evolution, niche, ecology, and whatnot. So this is the brief overview of how we have kind of come across ever since we started understanding the demographic parameters of what happened to kites, what happened to vultures. And then from idea of demography, we went on to study behavior. And quite recently, we have jumped into the domain of cognition, all driven by what black kites and other urban denizens do on day-to-day basis. So I'll just give a very brief overview of what we have done over the last 12, 13 years in Delhi in a very systematic fashion. So after I ended my undergrad with a very pathetic idea of even proving my hypothesis, quote unquote, proving, doing very bad science that decline in vultures has increased the number of kites, and that is why you see so many of them on landfills. And I also talked that the number of songbird and their decrease in Delhi is probably linked to this partially predator populations of black kites. So I faced a lot of backlash in Wildlife Institute when I was trying to defend this idea, and it became my master's dissertation project where we wanted to explore this properly as a scientific study that the decrease in number of vultures open the niche for black kites under the assumption that there is a huge overlap in their niches. And for that, initially we started with 10 sampling units. Now we have a set of 32 sampling units, which we monitor year after year in order to understand the variation in breeding density of black kites. The result was no. The breeding density of black kites registered in 1970s and monitored in different bits and pockets of Delhi has not changed in the last 70 years. Of course, there has been redistribution here and there, about which I can talk in detail later. So that pushed us to think that now there is clear absence of major overlap in what vultures used to do in their ecosystems and what kites used to do. Because if there was huge overlap, you would have seen some bit of like impact on kites as well. And for that, we wanted to understand where do where do kites call it home in a bustling city like Delhi, Bangalore, Pune, Mumbai, Kolkata, so on and so forth, because these are the places where you find massive populations of these birds. So we compared 150 nest locations with 150 random locations generated by computer, and it boiled down to very simple facts because these are very opportunistic birds. They can definitely take a lot of prey. So about 20 to 30% of their diet on an average comes from uh, direct predation, but they are very opportunistic in taking stuff from garbage. In Delhi, there is a very peculiar activity of tossing meat in air by Muslim population. So it is still practiced at Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur and by Kashmiri Pandits when these kites tend to breed. So also in Lahore as well. So what we found out that these mosque locations where people tend to offer meat to kites after several morning prayers become the sites which kites can identify as potential source of food. The cartoon showcases a loaf to depict that. And then if these mosque locations are tied with a lot of green patches where these kites can build nest, a large nest which can house a bird which is as large as your, in terms of wingspan, it is as much as your handspan can go. So you need to have a large enough tree. And once a green city like Delhi has an old traditional practice and it has patches of its old traditional locations where we have a lot of mosques, and it results into an ecological scenario to which kites have responded. And the areas where these food systems were created by devout Muslims were available started regulating where you will find nests. People can go into the detail depending upon their interest in statistics. Subsequently, we wanted to understand if individual birds taking advantage of these meat tossing activities, if they take this meat chunk and feed it to their young ones, we wanted to understand whether it translates into successful effects of breeding and whether it is registered in the variation of population density across the city. So once we calculated the amount of availability of similar kind of food at the plot level, the same set of variables again explain the variation in density. So there was a clear population level impact of how individual kites were choosing the nest locations in the city near the point locations of meat tossing. And and this was because on an average, within the breeding period from December to April, 90% of the diet of these kites is formed out of those meat chunks. So that is how effectively humans can augment the ecological expressions of a population, and how beautifully nature can respond to cultural processes happening in space and time. Of course, once we inspected the black kite nests for their nestlings and to register the growth rate, like checking all the boxes of traditional ornithology, we were affected by their aggressive behavior. So unlike their European counterparts, where they simply rush off from the nests whenever people do nest inspection, in Delhi and likewise systems, if you go near the nest and if you tend to climb on it, you get a tattoo, a free tattoo on your head. So if somebody wants, they can come over and join our fieldwork. And we examined whether the same set of variables which were explaining the habitat selection and which were explaining the population density variation would also explain the ordinal levels at which these populations were responding to nest inspection. So on 1/3 of kites used to vigorously attack us. And it was, of course, few aspects were quite logical, in the sense that if you have a lot of chicks in the nest, those kites would be more aggressive than the ones which have one chick. And if you have slightly more predictable success in the nest, then you would have better protection. So we also explored if kites could identify the value in their nest, and you can read about like these outcomes in our technical publications. I will not try to like emphasize on those parts, but the idea was that kites tend to attack because they not only have to defend their nest from human beings, kites also face kind of potential impacts from macaques and crows. And I guess our simplest translation was that these kites which take a decision to come down, swoop and attack on your head and go back and defend their nest in a peculiar fashion, would also be able to capably do that for other potential predators. So with this kind of prelude, I would quickly give you an example of how doing systematic sampling of behavior, population, and other aspects of movement ecology allows you to solve the problems in urban areas, because urban areas, unlike protected areas, have situations of conflict happening day after day. In this particular situation, our Air Force is under severe pressure because 62% of damage on their aircraft is caused by black kites. Several other birds, but because of the size of the birds and how sizably they respond to opportunistic amount of waste in and around these locations, or where we have to like place our aircraft in aerospace, kites becomes a very peculiar and typical problem. So, and because they're also soaring birds, and they can glide at a place for hours without alighting on a branch, they are number one arch nemesis for like Air Force. On 26th Jan, when we have a fixed wing aircraft showcasing a particular formation, they are under heavy threat because they fly at low altitudes and they can't simply change the course because they have to salute the chief guest. So under that scenario, all these kites which are there becomes quite a problem, and Air Force asked us to kill them or to capture them, of course, not fathoming the density of black kites, which is roughly 20 birds, 20 nesting birds per square kilometer. And we have like very poor idea of non-breeding population. You just saw 10,000 odd birds on one single landfill. So what we did was we experimentally suggested the idea of tossing meats outside the potential habitat zone, which has been marked by blue here. The pink on your screen is the path on which these aircraft fly on 26 Jan. In the coming season also it will happen. And what we suggested was that if kites can show congregation in less than 2 minutes, we strategically place these sites in conjugation with older sites where people traditionally do meat tossing, in order to draw these kites away and have a potentially open aerospace for our aircraft to fly. So this method is under like successive levels of enhancement. And in terms of numeric value, you can very clearly see that if at site locations where we are doing meat tossing increases the number of kites through congregation, it contributes to simultaneous decrease at the location where the aircraft formation is supposed to find threat. The same has been depicted in the extended formation where we had 9 locations alongside this whole trap, and we can discuss about this in detail. But I will take you back to that congregation point you saw on the opening slide where I showed you 10,000 birds congregating. Initially, we had no idea that these birds are migratory. And what happens after April every year, and it must be happening at multiple locations in India, including Bengaluru, then you see a sudden decline in the number of birds on landfill sites. So for us in April 2013, when I was a master's student at Wildlife Institute, I reported to my supervisors that I can't see enough kites. There are less than 1,000 birds. And their obvious response was, too lazy ho raha hai, tu dhang se dekh. Udhar hi hoga, they must be like stationed somewhere. So I did scan the whole area. Usually kites, unlike unlike other raptors, they also sit on the ground near these landfill locations because they're quite open areas, but they were nowhere to be found. But it took us 1 year subsequent to that when we placed a transmitter on the back of a kite, trying to understand the movement of a kite from the middle of the city. This is the zoo location, and another kite from the landfill site. And after it's released in April 2014, this kite never stopped. It started moving northwards after like encircling Delhi, and it started moving towards Himachal. Then it started moving parallel to Himalayas, and it went across Himalayas. To our surprise, it reached the base of Siberia. So before we have performed this kind of telemetry exercise, I did scan literature which informed us that people in Mysuru, people in Punjab, they have reported black-eared kites. But then in all our famous bird books, you will find them that people discuss about the presence of black-eared kites, which is Milvus migrans lineatus, all along Himalayas mostly. So this is how poorly we are informed about the idea of natural history, about birds as common as kites, and which requires a lot of focus from multiple perspectives, which I'm going to illustrate through this presentation. So kites tend to take rest after they alight from this arduous journey across Himalayas. They cross Himalayas at 6,500 meters height, and they stop at the town called Hotan, which is in the river valley. In their return journey, they congregate here, which is the town of Urumqi, again, and both of these towns are on Silk Route. So Silk Route is roughly 5,000 years old. And this is how human habitation, the idea of what animals do and respond to human habitation, takes center stage when the scales at which we operate are creating impacts and ripples on nature, and then nature responds back. I think COVID-19 has taught us that exact phenomena so beautifully in terms of how something which erupted as an infection in China took center stage in more than 200 nations across the world in less than 3 months. And for that, we wanted to quantify wastefulness of these fantastic monuments of 21st century, I should say, because Qutbuddin Aibak and Iltutmish, they built brick minaret of, of, of Qutub Minar. And 21st century people have built Ghazipur, which is roughly a 70-meter tall structure in 21st century. Probably we will inform our kids that this is the monument. A lot of people call it Hawk Mountain because of that kind of congregation. So on the screen, you can see how we were slightly smart in terms of using the tag kite and the amount of time they used to spend on these landfills to come up with the maximum congregation number, which is roughly 35,000 per single day, because there are 3 major congregations which we have noticed. And Ghazipur slaughters more than 1 lakh poultry birds, which yields 27,000 metric tons of poultry waste every year. These kind of wasteful city systems in South Asia and likewise areas create novel human impacts. They have ecological ripples in the form of these birds coming to India after doing 5,000 kilometer long journeys and congregating in a single landfill point. So just before you could see these yellow areas, so this yellow part, which is the breeding part of these 20 birds, which we have tagged in 2014 onwards, is 85 times larger than their wintering part, which is signaled here in green. So the impact of human in terms of creating landfill is less than 200-300 years old. And these kites originated 25 million years ago. So we are quite junior in terms of having spent n number of years on Earth on that virtue. And definitely these birds must have been like moving back and forth on the same journey because it's such an innate response, bird migration, for thousands of years. And that is why our research group is interested in the benefits and cost coming from this kind of spatial response by birds which come from an area which is larger than Germany and which gets kind of constricted in and around Delhi and NCR in terms of these birds getting congregated in response to what humans are offering them on the face. Not only that, when you do not have these birds, about 90% of these birds, they go back after the breeding season starts in their native spaces, and the numbers reduce from 10,000 to less than 1,000, which I just shared, and that reduces the service which these kites provide. So about 35,000 kites remove about 9% of poultry waste from Gazipur, but after April, this service reduces to 0.03%. And that creates humongous impact on what Gazipur is doing silently in form of its climate change impacts. So Gazipur alone annually produces more methane than all methane which is leaked from the gas stubs in United States. So that is how humongous impact landfills have. And we have close to 10,000 of these landfills distributed across the face of Earth, which are oozing methane every second we are discussing this topic. There is a vital importance of what these birds like kites could do by providing ecosystem service, because you can see that the transition through the service and contribution of poultry waste to the methane produced by Gazipur increases from 4% to 26% because you don't have kites to support us through this free scavenging service. So that was just about Gazipur. If you see the scenario of world where every country wants to be better in terms of its GDP and everybody wants to be a 5 trillion economy in the coming future, you have consequences in terms of economic proliferation reflected in the sense of how people would like to do and how people would like to live better and people would like to eat better. It is gently reflected in the form of per capita consumption of meat. For Delhi in last 20 years, it has increased 7 times. So 700% increase in 20 years, and Delhi is now the champion city in terms of per capita income in the country. Imagine what chicken in every pot would mean when this bird, which used to be less than a kg 50 years ago, on an average weighs more than 4 kilos today. In turn, it has reduced the wild bird population. So this transformation of biomass for poultry has impacted the wild birds, and they are just 1/3 of what they used to be 70 years ago. So once you have 525 million tons of chicken waste produced from all over the world, I'm unsure about its ecological ripples. You just saw what 1 lakh poultry slaughter at Gazipur could do to birds which are coming from an area which is as large as northern India itself. So details about these publications can inform you better about the precarious situation we have been building with our economic proliferation and with the way we are creating a room of requirement, which we call as 21st century cities. The trouble is there are other denizens on Earth who have been here for millions of years, and who deserve to be here on Earth as much as we do. When I superimpose the paths which you saw of kite migration, it coincides with the pathways or highways which birds use to come and visit cities like Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, and the areas interspersed with it. So the various shades on the screen are depicting multiple pathways. Asian flyway or Central Asian flyway is very vital. As you can see, it's overlap with other flyways. Unfortunately, least studied because of obvious reasons. It is around this flyway has countries which don't invest as much in research as required. So if you see more number of triangles which depict the virulent strain of avian influenza, कि China में ज़्यादा है, India has slightly lesser, and Africa has slightly lesser, that probably we're better than China. No. China has done better research than us, and that is why they've been able to identify the threat of not only kites, but so many billions of birds using these pathways and transferring the virulent strain of avian influenza from Central Asia to southern latitudes. In the absence, it is very important for us to learn and negotiate with this particular threat, because the gradient of gray which is there on your screen depicts the poultry farming. 98% of future poultry increase would come in areas of Africa, South Asia, and South China. And once we see the scenario of poultry poultry rearing in India, up until 2010, 70% of our poultry used to happen in backyards. I think this number would have reduced, or this fraction would have reduced, but still in villages and in poor areas, in urban scenarios, you have people who keep poultry, chicken, different type of ducks, geese in the backyards, which builds a potential scenario of migratory bird linkages with resident birds which are being grown in your backyard, which will create stepping stone for a potential zoonosis like COVID-19. So this is just one face of it, but then it also has sociological implications that suddenly people who rear poultry face atrocities when once you have pandemic like situations. I'm very sure if you have come across this particular song about the poultry situation. So I'll skip the component and jump to the idea which started or which nudged us to do the science of cognition in relation to the links in behavior and population, which we have just established through the discussion on kites. So through kites, we learned the idea of how quickly non-humans can respond to the geography of cultural practices and the geography of resources available for non-humans in time and space. And I just discussed how quickly we use that to. This is how we were trying to attract kites in order to safeguard the flight formations of 26 January for the past 2 years. And because our research was not well supported initially, we had to do jugaad and use this polythene sheet to keep the meat fresh and to keep kites better attracted. Unfortunately, to our surprise, these kites did not take meat which was spread on the polythene sheet. So you can see that kites are taking meat from the ground, but not from the polythene sheet. Subsequently, after the exercise ended and we brushed off the amount of meat which was there on this polythene sheet, kites did not take this meat again. But when the same person started tossing this meat with his hand, the same meat was taken. So in terms of cognitive ecology, these things are called valence in terms of the periodicity of how birds relate the cue and the information which certain cues carry and its impact on the behavior of animals. So I'm still learning these aspects of cognitive ecology, but it was quite surprising for us that birds which have been consuming meat chunks at this particular location for hundreds of years suddenly have a problem when you put the same meat chunks on the polythene sheet, and even if you brush off that meat chunk from the top of the polythene sheet. Surprisingly, with this particular situation at landfill of Gazipur, when we provided 120 kilograms of meat on top of these poultry slaughter facilities, where these kites happily sit and consume 120 kilograms of meat, this chicken discard meat was not taken for 3 days. So this is the level at which animals which are taking a lot of garbage from a backyard are processing information in terms of what is conducive for them to take and what limits their expression, which brings down to the future of where our work would progress, where we are asking questions about the instincts of scavengers on a planet which is warming because of human impacts, not only through the use of fossil fuel, but also when you proliferate and increase your per capita meat consumption, you tend to contribute to release of methane from your landfills, which are not well regulated. So it's a coexistential crisis in multiple direct and indirect ways that it can create climate change impact. Directly, it can create situations where humans and non-humans can come into conflict, and we can have scenarios where pathogens can use these new vector relationships to express themselves. So moving on from kites to dogs, I will just give a 5-minute overview of small research projects which have started over the last 1.5 years. In Delhi, once we wanted to understand the historic idea of wolf-like creatures giving rise to modern-day dogs, and how humans creating or allocating food for non-humans must have created very, very drastic change in the spatial responses. So on an average, a wolf home range is 200 square kilometer, and a modern day like dog pack home range is 0.002 kilometer square, which is 1 by 2 lakh times shorter. So once you have reduced the expression of where these animals call it a territory, I'm very sure that it needs a reworking of sociality within themselves, because they use howling, they use scent marking, and they use a lot of visual cues to interact amongst themselves. You must have seen two dogs baring their teeth, much like how wolves bare to each other. But dogs are the most numerous carnivore on earth in terms of even like wild existence. And we are toying with this interesting concepts which discuss dear enemy or nasty neighbor. So happy to go into the details. One set of hypothesis which was prompted by our last year's work on estimating the densities of dogs in Delhi was the character displacement hypothesis. So character displacement is usually referred, or adaptive radiation is usually referred with Darwin's work on Darwin's finches, on Darwin's finches from Galapagos. But Nico Tinbergen's work has provided us with a lot of evidence that behavior can also evolve much like organs, much like how beaks evolved in finches in response to how resource is being allocated, and how allocation of resource can differentiate personalities. So once we came up with the idea of about 1 million dogs in the streets of Delhi, with the density roughly 550 per square kilometer. And when we compared it with UP, which is roughly 70 times less dense in terms of having dogs across the state. So I wanted to understand a numeric criteria, which I call now as the mutual burden of coexistence, where I created this ratio of peopleage to dogs, and I multiplied it with the ratio of political areas for UP and Delhi. I found that value to be more than 500. And it indicates the synergistic impacts of higher human dog densities, which are packed in much smaller political areas. So once you have these kind of expressions, you build mutual burden of coexistence. And once you have streets which are simultaneously more littered with a lot of food, and once you have the same streets where people come and feed not only dogs, but monkeys and different kind of birds, you tend to create novel selection pressures, or you can tend to create opportunities for different kind of animal personalities. So the hypothesis which we are testing is that once you litter the same streets where you provide a lot of food to dogs, you will have a disruptive selection. And we are doing playback experiments to understand that, happy to understand it better through discussion. And the problem is not just local. These are the last few slides. Yeah. So the problem is not just local from Ladakh down to Kanyakumari and Gujarat to Northeast. The problem of dogs reclaiming your vehicles. I'm unsure if that happens in Bangalore, but the density at which dogs and humans share their living spaces, you have dog co-owners for your vehicles. Happy to talk about that. You have seen a lot of cows moving in the streets of Delhi. This year, we came up with the prediction of density of these not so stray cows. So these are very productive cows, about 90% of them, which urban poor rear on the urban waste itself. Of course, there are benefits to the urban poor, but there are costs in terms of having traffic mayhem, and there are costs in terms of like unknowing impacts of brucellosis, anthrax, and other kind of zoonotic diseases which are neglected for the tropical world. Similarly, very recently, we have come up with evidence where we showed that the genome of antimicrobial resistance, which humans have for close to 13 top-rated antibiotics against which humans have resistance, are also present in monkeys, which are very, very regularly fed by people in the streets of Delhi. So once we have evidence that close to 1 lakh people lose, close to like 1 million people lose their life every year because of poor management of how antibiotics are sold across the counter in countries like India. And this number could increase to 10 million or 15 million over 2030. We need to see how unknowingly we are also kind of spreading this to the non-humans who share their food with us. So that summarizes the idea of how my current fellowship project of 5 years tries to understand how human allocation of food to non-humans in the form of waste and in the form of ritual feeding is changing the social distancing within the same species and across the human non-human interface. And once we are trying to create the room of requirement for ourselves, and potentially we want to still be called as region of the world which has a lot of heart for non-humans. And when we want to call our cities as room of requirement for non-humans because we have cultural tolerance for non-humans, we need to monitor the potential ways in which pathogens can jump across the barrier. We need to monitor the cultural expressions both on the side of humans from social sciences and from the side of non-humans from the idea of behavioral and cognitive sciences, because the science of animal culture is taking shape over the last 10 years. And collectively, my research group Think Pause would lay foundations for the future of coexistence in our kind of cities. So with that, I thank the team through which this beautiful research story has been created, and my institutions and funding bodies. Happy to discuss further.
Thanks so much, Nishant, for that amazing presentation. And I'm sure you have touched upon so many areas of research which you're doing. And it's really interesting to see the sort of questions which you're sort of dealing with here, ranging from change in behavioral phenotypes to development of antimicrobial resistance, transmission of disease, and so on. And at the backdrop of all this is the biomass pyramid, which you sort of spoke about. So it was really fascinating. And there are some questions in our Q&A box. So should I read them out one by one, or are you able to see them?
I can read, but if you read, at
Okay.
least it will be visible.
Sure. So the first question is talking about the use of painkillers, which are present in dead carcasses, and its impact on the vulture populations, and what remedies have been provided.
So I will quickly answer that part. I guess
Yeah.
as community of researchers and managers, we agree that diclofenac sodium, which was the cause or which is the main painkiller which plummeted the vulture numbers, It has been banned for animal use since 2006. The large formulations have also been banned since 2012, but there are ways and means where people can procure this for non-human usage. And the research says that even if 1% carcasses have diclofenac, we will never be able to recover vulture populations. So our main task is to release vultures from captivity while we reduce the usage of diclofenac and similar drugs.
And have any initiatives been taken to releasing vultures from captivity or
Yes.
something,
So this year,
rewilding kind of things?
yes. So last year they started releasing vultures from captivity. 20 birds were released with like satellite transmitters, and I think 20 or 40 more birds would be released in Assam from Rani this year. So that phase has started, and it will soon take over.
And I believe it also has to do something with not something, a lot with the awareness which has been generated around vultures as a species. Because now we have vulture sanctuaries coming up in different parts of the country. Although they are small, government or like formal protection has been granted to areas for conserving wild vulture population. So I think that would also be a good remedy.
Set, I guess for vultures, we are like penning an article where we want to put it as the best poster boy for global conservation because it entwines both with our protected areas and human-dominated areas. And unless we have a parity in terms of how we differently treat vultures in these two systems, recovery of vulture is a far-fetched dream.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is about the impact of change in food availability for the hill myna in their natural niche in Chhattisgarh, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
and Orissa region, and their migration towards urban areas and population estimates. And is there any possible remedies for these changes in the food availabilities and so on?
I guess like when we talk about remedies as humans, we want to jump to solutions, but as a very not so okay ornithologist, because in terms of being an ornithologist, I know only about kites, something about vultures, and few more. But there's so many different birds which are showcasing tremendous responses as we discuss this, for which we have absolutely no idea except for the distribution ranges. So I guess we should study them better before we talk about remedies. So migration is one such black hole in terms of absence of information.
Yeah.
So sorry, I
And
can.
I feel that, just to add on to what you so rightly pointed out, that although we know little about many of the species, birds still continue to be a group of animals for which there is a lot of enthusiasm in collecting data. So you have platforms like eBird.
Mhm.
So basically, collecting natural history observations should also gain more importance, I feel,
100%.
because that is something which we generally lack on. We have so many observations on distribution, like you said, but natural history, we have like hardly any observations, even for a group of animals as charismatic as birds. So I think that could be a sort of make a way towards leading to this in some sense. Yeah.
So natural history 100% because our quality of natural history has drastically declined after like 1950s, 60s because we have like people who want to be professionals up front while not spending enough time in the backyards, wherever they are, forests, urban areas, rural areas, all of it.
And I think part of it is also reflected by the sort of giving less importance to this kind of research, or even familiarizing students at an early stage in their education with natural history as a subject. Because I believe that it's something where we are sort of lacking. And
So
I'm
I'm
sure
happy
there
to
have been
say,
initiatives to sort of fix that, and there are a lot of things coming up, but it is going to be a sort of longish journey, I feel, to reach to that.
bilkul, 100%. Yeah.
So the next question was about uh, if we can focus on the use of chicken feathers and other byproducts by channelizing its use for deriving certain other products. So would you like to comment on that?
Thanks. So the idea is that our economy, although it's fourth in the world, the people are quite differently placed on the economic ladder. And believe me, everything under the sky is being used as byproduct, including the waste which Delhi is creating in the winter season. So slaughter of 100,000, 1 lakh morgo ka kachra. It moves from Delhi 1700 kilometers and reaches Bengal because the trucks which bring fishes to Delhi take back this chicken slaughter waste. So that is the level at which people are trying to do it. But then because while you produce so much of waste, there is such a quick response by these birds, and people have this cultural expression that if this odd bird is eating something out from this waste, maybe we should allow. So that is how we are slightly differently placed from other nations. So a lot of nations are going to use this byproduct of chicken slaughter for generating biofuel. It has been discussed in literature. But for all of that, we need better preparation and we need better formalization. We need equipments where you can do these segregations. I'm unsure if anybody has seen these massive sites where they are slaughtered. So it's quite a sight for an average person. So once you go to that level of processing chicken for a city which is 30 million in strength, these nitty-gritties always come where there is only a limited which you can handle. So the wash down from blood, the components of feather which can be utilized are 100% utilized. So in the flea markets of Delhi, Sarojini Nagar, and Lajpat, you get a 500 rupee sleeping bag because they come from the down feathers of poultry. But whatever cannot be consumed by humans through circular economy is taken by the non-human denizens.
So there is also a question about what strategies could be adopted to avoid transmission of avian influenza strains that doesn't have a previous transmission record, and can that be a concern for a pandemic like situation in the future?
I fully agree with the idea of sharing living spaces with migratory birds, not just kites, but kites are predators and scavengers, which can feed on water birds, for which we have clear evidence that they carry the most virulent strains of avian influenza. And every time there is a bird flu scare, we can be 100% sure that it has been transferred to the poultry by some migratory activity. So recently, not just north-south migration, even east-west migration from Central Asia to England plummeted the kittiwake shore colonies by 70%. So this is a threat which is looming on our heads, whether we are a developed country or a developing country. And I guess if people have read history, then after the First World War itself, we infected more than 10 times the people who were infected by COVID-19, and 10 times more people lost their lives. So that is how threatening the situation is once you build your room of requirement or cities for yourself and you do not have space for non-humans. Tragically, for South Asia, we have a lot of space for non-humans, but we have poor surveillance of what costs are around when once you allow these birds to consume the garbage, once you allow these birds to consume a lot of food which you offer to them, at times intentionally, at times because you are just putting out waste. So I would say better surveillance of the migratory paths in response to how we are urbanizing, better surveillance of the kind of pathogens would allow us to be prepared, if not 100% secure from potential zoonosis.
Thank you. There is a question about uh, sort of use of remote sensing and GPS based methods to sort of understand the cognitive ecology of birds. So, does that play a big role in understanding this?
I 100% agree that we can use GPS technology, but GPS technology, along with natural history and close contact understanding of what these birds are doing on ground, is required. And with GPS, I think in order to understand the cognitive ecology, you need to have extensive coverage. So when we say that we have 20 birds per square kilometer, 20 nests per square kilometer in Delhi, then you need hundreds of birds carrying these GPS devices. So currently, over the last 10 years, we have just deployed 35. So it's almost nothing. So once we do similar kind of studies outside India, they sample 800,000 or more birds. So that gives them the quality of information where they can use it not only for movement ecology and behavior, but also for cognitive ecology to understand how they're responding to anthropogenic drivers and restrictions.
So,
So
are there any specific roadblocks which you encountered while putting on the GPS tags or the collars? So, like you
no,
said, you could put only say 30 or whatever as compared to, oh yeah, the
the only
funding remains.
constraint is
Okay,
paisa. We're trying to augment that by collaborating with University of East Anglia
okay,
and a firm in Germany, and they have like agreed to like do transfer of technology under Make in India campaign. So
okay,
hopefully that should bring down the cost of these transmitters. So the only
right.
constraint is
Okay, because usually for handling or tagging a lot of wildlife, one of the concerns is also the permissions and clearances from the concerned department. So that was my sort of
I think
motive.
it's the
But yeah,
exposition limitation. So our
right.
managers have not been exposed to the benefits which these like tags provide, and the ways in which I can't say there is no impact, but the impacts are very minimal, and the benefit of the kind of data you get is outstanding with respect to certain challenges or certain threats we might be facing from so many different non-human populations. So I guess over the time, if we expose our managers from forest department and civic bodies to the benefits. And if we can showcase how safe it is, probably they would be more welcoming. So I have done that by welcoming them on discussions around tagging and telemetry. We let them release birds so they
Right.
understand it's safe.
Yeah, that's a good strategy, I think. So there's also a question on how we can design cities in a way that minimizes negative impacts on wildlife while still providing benefits for both humans and animals.
So for this question, which goes slightly into the philosophical zone, I would try and sum up by saying that our cities are quite different from the Western cities, which didn't have the planning component from the word go, or shall I say, which had a very different planning component because it was kind of the benchmark was ecosystem regulation. Of late, we have been following the Western regulation where Western infrastructure is incorporated, and we can use railways, you can use waterways, you can use airways to ship so much of resources in this 3% land area. But then problem with South Asia is our heart. Like we have Indian ethos of how we are practicing it, and in the absence of scientific evidence, we tend to do more wrong than what is right, even when people are so driven to help the non-humans. So the idea of like minimizing the negative impacts would be respecting our cultural ethos and evaluating the meaning of those ethos in 21st century. So if we have evidence towards that, nothing works better than evidence to convince your people, both in the policy and citizens. So that is how I would try and say that in short, we could manage our cities better.
Yeah. So then there is also, yeah. So there was a question about cost impact of putting a single satellite tag. So could you give
So
a,
cost in terms of price. So the good tag costs still costs more than 1.5 lakhs per tag. So there are cheaper versions, but they don't give you that extensive and clear data. So they cost less than a lakh. So any good tag is still more than 70,000 Indian rupees per unit. And if you're talking about cost on the life of bird per se, then it varies from species to species. For kites, we have published a paper where there was no impact on the utility of these tags. Once you maintain the overall weight of tag in the harness less than 4%, which is much like do you feel bad when you, or do you consciously understand that you're wearing a watch or you're wearing a garment, because the overall weight of the artifacts which we are wearing is less than 4%. So once that is kept in mind, it reduces the impact, but it varies. The impact varies from species to species. Not on kites, definitely. They're quite hardy, and it explains why they are so successful in our cities.
okay. So I think we have discussed all the questions. There was a comment from Professor Jagannath, but I think he will get back to you,
Okay.
or like you can discuss with him. He has provided his contact details in this.
Okay.
chat window. So yeah, so if yeah, I
There was
think
something about Professor Ranjit Daniel and Ullas
yeah.
Karan. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I think I have lost it.
Ah,
Okay,
Ranjit Daniel and Ullas Karan have
yeah.
pioneered studies.
Uh,
I definitely agree that we have had the technology of monitoring different wildlife and common fauna through telemetry technology, but the leap for progress has been achieved for which Nobel Prize was awarded in chemistry in 2017, if I'm not wrong. So lithium-ion batteries and the reducing cost of like sending satellites by each different country has kind of cut the cost of telemetry by 90%. So I think 2010 onwards is said to be the golden period of understanding the movement ecology of animals. So that is the level at which probably Dr. Karant and Professor Daniel, I'm unsure if he's still alive. So they would appreciate how easier it is to do animal telemetry in today's world. Hopefully, ISRO would understand our concerns and send Indian satellites would probably reduce by it by 99%. We are quite cost effective as an agency. So
sure. So I think we can end our session today, and please join me in thanking Dr. Nishant for sharing so many details on his very interesting work. And despite facing significant challenges today, which were pretty unexpected for him, so thank you so much. And it was really interesting to hear about your work. And I look forward to you being participating in the futures webinars which we have organized.
I would be glad to participate, and I'm very thankful to all of you for this opportunity to share research stories from Delhi. Hopefully, we could start some in Bangalore soon.
Yeah. So I think now we can just have I can hand it over to uh, Mansi, maybe.
Thank you, Mihir. I think we just wanted to share with whoever is still with us that this is the first webinar in a series of 4 webinars. So the coming Thursdays, 3 of the coming Thursdays, we'll have webinars on once again looking at different aspects of urban ecology, and we urge you to sign up, register for that. And just briefly, if there are people here who don't know about BSF, I'll just quickly introduce BSF, Bengaluru Sustainability Forum. We are an interinstitutional initiative to drive conversations and collaborations with a focus on Bangalore's sustainability. And I urge you to check out our website, bengalurusustainabilityforum.org, where you will also get to see a whole lot of projects that we have supported under the BSF Small Grants Program, and um, which is like a repository of very interesting work in the areas of biodiversity, lake, climate change, and waste that's happening in the city. And we had a very great time collaborating with the IIHS library and Mihir on the urban ecology exhibition, as a part of which this webinar series is being organized. And maybe Pradeep can introduce and speak a little bit about that before we end for the day. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I'm Pradeep, representing for IHS and the library. And IHS is a national education institution committed for equitable, sustainable, and efficient transformation of Indian settlements. We offer programs and build capacity on different disciplinary areas of urban. The library at the Bangalore is established in 2012, and since 2014 we have been open to public. We had the honor and privilege to collaborate for this wonderful exhibition with Mihir and with BSF team here. And the exhibition is open until December. We have a variety of resources, including the BSF publications, popular works, field guides on display. Please come if you're around. And you can learn more about upcoming webinars and the exhibition on our website. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, Mihir and Nishant, and thanks to all the audience members who joined us today. We hope to see you back with us next Thursday, 4 p.m. The registration links are separate for every webinar, so please keep that in mind. You will have to register separately for each of them. And thank you to Abhishek
Thank
also
you.
for
Abhishek.
facilitating the webinar. Abhishek is from the NCBS instrumentation team. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Abhishek.
Thank you.
Thanks.